Okay, in tonight's After Effects lecture, we are going to cover particles and particle world. So we're going to open up After Effects and get started. Here we go. We're going to break this into two sections. So the first section of this lecture is going to be basically covering how to set up the plugin Particle World, and then we're going to go through and step through all of the different parameters. Now, I am not like a Particle World guru. I've taught this several times, but there's still a few things inside of Particle World that I really haven't ever used. So I'm going to do the best job that I can kind of trying to explain how to use everything, and you're going to see the effects happen on your screens. You guys should kind of follow along, manipulate things, play around with little things, but do pay attention and kind of work with me through each step so that you can see how these things work. So obviously we need a new composition, so we're going to start with 1920 by 1080, 24p. I'm going to make this 10 seconds long because it can be 7 to 10 seconds long, and I haven't decided what I want to do yet. But we'll just start there. I'm going to call this my main comp, and I'm going to click OK. All right, so right away we have our composition up. So there are a couple things that you need when you work with Particle World. You need a layer solid. That is how Particle World works. You can put particles on all kinds of different layers, but generally when you use this, you're going to be using it on a layer solid, and that's generally how other plugins work as well. Plugins like Particular, which we just looked at. So do go in and create a new layer solid. Let's create this layer solid with like a neutral gray color. You do want a color this time because there's sections of Particle World that pull from the layer color when it displays on screen. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a neutral gray color and click OK. The other thing that I'm going to check straight away, and you guys should do this too on your machines, is let's set our composition to work in 8-bit, just simply to save render time. So particle systems are very CPU and render intensive, so when we're setting these things up, it's a good idea to work in 8-bit. If you are layering up different particle effects to create lighting effects and whatnot, or glows, things like that, which we'll touch on a little bit later, you can bump that back up to 16-bit before you export. So let's click on where it says 16-bit in the project window and set that depth to 8 bits per channel. This will just help us work a little bit quicker. Click OK. All right, so we're in the main comp. We've got a gray solid right now down there in the main comp. I'm going to go ahead and rename my solid and call it Particles to start, and then we're going to go ahead and find Particle World. So if I type in particle, you can see that I've got a couple different particle system options over there. I've got CC Particle Systems 2, CC Particle World, and Particle Playground. Now generally if I have to work with anything After Effects and particles and I don't have Trapcode Particular, I'm using CC Particle World. So let's grab Particle World and dump it onto our layer solid. And this should be what you see. And if you scrub across the screen, you're going to see a fountain of fiery little particle lines coming out of the producer in the center of the screen. Damien.
For particles, would it be a good idea to make the resolution half?
Yep, you can set the resolution up as half when you're working. That's fine. I'm looking at it at 50% right now. It does, as you can see, change the look a little bit of your particles. When you look at different resolutions, like if I go down to quarter, you can see that it really drastically changes the way that the particles are rendered. So before you go to render, you're going to want to look at a full res preview so that you can see what your particles look like and make sure they're doing what you want them to do. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I got a quick question about the color bits on the side. So we have 32, 16, and 8.
Right.
Does the 32 automatically mean it's a better effect, or is it just how detailed it can get?
So 32-bit is the bit depth or the color depth that the particles that particular plugin will work at, right? So Particle World will only really work its best at 16-bit. Particle Systems 2 is a 32-bit float plugin, so it'll work if you use 32-bit float, which you can.
Is it better because it can?
It's not necessarily better. It just means that when you render it, you can render it at 32-bit if you want to.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to set my resolution to half. When you start out, this stuff will render fine at full res. I mean, when you're it's not doing anything super crazy right now, but pumping a bunch of particles out. But let's start going through the interface of this. So straight away, let's go to our effects and controls, and you'll see the particle world open dialog box, basically, of the effect. So you can see all the different stuff that you have to work with. So generally, if we step through this, let's start at the top with grids and guides. So when you put particle world onto a particle system, you're going to see all these different kind of indicators of what's happening inside of CC particle world. So a couple things to note. This grid on the bottom, that is called the floor, and the floor can be used in interesting ways inside of particle world. This little line in the middle, I believe, is the horizon line, or it might also be like the height that the producer is at. The little red sphere that you see in the middle, and it is a sphere, is the producer itself. That's how big the producer is. And then this box in the upper left-hand corner is like a faux camera box. So if you grab that box and click on it, you can actually look at your particles in 3D. This is a 3D plugin. It works in 3D space. It will work with 3D cameras inside of After Effects, which is pretty cool. So you can actually rotate the camera around your particles, which can create some interesting effects. But you can, if you want to look at your particles in different ways, you can grab that box in the upper left-hand corner and just spin it around, and it will change the camera orientation of the particle system itself. We're going to be clicking reset a bunch when we're working today, so go ahead and go over to the effect if you've messed with anything, and just go ahead and click reset, and it will set it back to its standard settings. Okay, so grids and guides. Grids and guides basically allows you to see different things inside of your particle system, or turn different things on and off. So position and radius, you can turn those things on and off. The motion path you can turn on and off. Right now we don't have any motion on our particles, so we're not going to see a path. Motion path frames will basically tell it how many frames of the path that you actually want to be seeing when you have motion on your particles. The grid or floor is basically that thing that I told you about on the bottom that shows where the floor is. You can have it show the producer, you can have it show the world, etc., etc. We want the grid position to be the floor for right now. Grid subdivisions, this isn't something that I've ever really needed to play with too much. It's set to 16. That's probably going to be fine for most of what you're going to do with the grid. The grid size, what happened there? I'm going to reset again. Grid size just increases its size, so if you need to see it smaller or larger, depending on what you're trying to do there, you can use the floor to help line up particles in 3D shots. Like, let's say you're having sparks explode over a street, right? Well, the street should be the floor, and you can kind of help line the camera up with the grid on the bottom by using perspective and whatnot when you're working on something like having something explode over a surface. The horizon is that gray line in the background. You can turn that on and off, and you can also turn the axis box on and off. And that's the basics of grids and guides. Whenever you click off of that effect or that layer, it will shut all that extraneous stuff off, so that you won't actually see it when you look at a fully rendered particle system. It will display the way that it's supposed to. So then right after that, we have the birth rate controller. So the birth rate's pretty straightforward. It's how many pixels are being born every second. If you increase that birth rate, your particle densities are going to go way up. If you increase the birth rate, render times will also go way up. So the more particles you have spitting onto the screen, the more time it's going to take to render stuff. Again, this renders pretty well because it's just the stock settings. We haven't really done anything too crazy with it yet. We don't have any motion blur or any tracking or cameras or anything crazy like that going on. We don't have multiple particle systems layered up to create certain effects, etc., etc. So just keep tabs on that. Birth rate, make sure that you only are birthing as many particles as you need to. 24 frames per second. No, I want to set that to 2. Thank you. Okay, longevity. So longevity is, again, pretty straightforward. It's how long your particles last on the screen. Right now, these particles are living for 1 second, and then they die. So if we decrease the time that the particles live, you will see that my particle system gets smaller, right? Because the particles are only living for 0.33 seconds. So they are birthed and then they die after 0.33 seconds. And you can increase that too. So if you want to create certain effects where particles live for a long time on the screen and don't die, that's where you control it with longevity. I'm just going to reset my particle system real quick and push play, and we'll start over again. All right, so those are the birth rate and longevity. Now we're going to get into some fun. The producer. So the producer is that red sphere that you see in the middle when you have the particle system selected. So if I go back to 0, you can see that little sphere right there. You can change the producer's position with X, Y, and Z. So you can make this thing fly and move around, which is really cool. So you can kind of track it to things and make it move across the screen, which can come in really handy. Like one instance that I use is, let's say you have a magic wand and you want to make it look magical. Well, you could motion track the end of the wand and then use some skullduggery to make that track the particle system to the wand so that particles come out of your wand. There's all kinds of neato things that you can do with position, obviously. Radius. Radius is how large that particle system is in X, Y, and Z. And you can see interesting things start to happen straight away when you start playing with the size of the producer, right? If I stretch that producer out along the X-axis, this stops looking more like a firework and starts to look more like what would maybe be a waterfall or something like that. Or if you were creating a waterfall, this might be the little bits of water that are flying off those surfaces. So there's all kinds of neato things that you can do with the producer and different ways that you can achieve different effects with the producer. So I just played with the X-axis right there, but you can also increase the radius in Y and Z. So right now I kind of have this tower producer producing all these showering particles on the Y-axis, and then you can do the same thing with the Z-axis too. So I just stretch this out on the Z-axis, and now the producer's coming right at the camera, and I've got some interesting effects happen. If I spin my camera around, you can see what this particle system kind of looks like from different angles. I'm going to go ahead and reset again, just get us back to 1. All right, so there's your producer, and all of those things are animatable. You can see that a lot of these effects are going to be animatable, so you can control them over time. And when I say what you need to do with this project is go in and make these particles form a specific function, that's where the animation comes in. So you're going to be animating things like the producer radius, the position, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff all at the same time. So let's go to the next one. We'll talk about physics. So physics. Straight away on top, we have the animation type. This specific type is set to explosive, and you can see that there's a whole bunch of different animation types that you can use to create particle systems inside of Particle World. So let's just step through them. Direction axis. This makes your particles spew in a specific direction. So now instead of just going in kind of an omni-direction, they go in one specific direction. So what do you think that might be useful for?
Water coming out of a pipe.
Yeah, excellent. Water coming out of a pipe, or like fire coming out of a dragon's mouth, or maybe out of the end of a blowtorch. If you wanted particles to come out of your eyeballs or something like that, you might want to have a directional axis so that you can control the direction in which those particles are spitting. Go ahead, Elijah.
Smoke.
Smoke, yep, smoke is good. And you can see that you can control the direction axis with these extra and extra angle. You can control some of the ways that this particle spews, basically. The other thing that's kind of neat is you'll see that when you set direction axis as your animation type, you also get this handy dandy little gizmo, which you can control the directional axis with. So if I kind of reset this and set that back to direction axis, you can see that you can control how you want this to fire out of that little producer by using that gizmo. The gizmo can be a little tricky to use, so you may want to like use the different parameters that you have over here to actually control the angle of it, etc. So there's direction axis, cone axis. This is basically turns the directional thing into like a cone that spews out of the top. So this again is useful for things like making water come out of pipes or making fire come out of mouths or eyeballs or what have you. And you can use your little gizmo to fire those particles in whatever orientation you might want them to come out of. Let's look at viscous. So viscous is supposed to kind of be more like a oil or fluid type of particle explosion. So if we kind of play these back, you can see the different ways that these animation types affect the particles. So if I type in explosive, you can see that they kind of come out with a little more velocity. They come out from every angle. And viscous is just a little bit different. The way that the particles move and interact is slightly different. Twirl, pretty self-explanatory. Now the particles twirl out of the producer. If we look at that in 3 dimensions, you can kind of see that it creates this kind of cone effect or swirly effect. What do you think twirl might be useful for creating? Tornado, sure. Yep, good. Let's look at twirly. Twirly is another twirly type of particle system. You can see the particles kind of come out in a weird way with the twirly effect. Kind of creates this big cyclone almost. So there's some cool stuff you could do with that. Like if you wanted to have, say you wanted to create, Dorothy's house flying in the middle of a tornado, this might be a good way to produce that look.
Kind of violent blizzard, like an overhead shot of a blizzard.
Sure, yep.
Zooming down into it.
Yep, good. Vortex. Vortex is another good one for creating tornadoes. It's got a really defined edge on it. If you start playing around with how you look at this vortex, I'm going to go ahead and reset this again just to kind of get it back to 1 so we can see what it's actually doing in its stock location. So this kind of changes the way that the gravity works on the particles. Instead of the particles falling down, they fall up when they're emitted from a vortex producer. Fire. Pretty self-explanatory, has a very fiery look to it. The particles kind of are emitted from the producer and then again fall up, but they have a kind of chaotic nature about them, so you can definitely use the fire one to create some interesting fire effects, like let's say boosters out of the back of a rocket or something like that would be very good to use fire on. You can also use it to create things like, actual fire particles and things like that, like for torches or whatever. You could use them to create that type of a look. So let's move down here. I think we've got through a few of these. Jet sideways. This obviously has a different look to it. I'm going to reset this again just so we can see what it looks like when it's stock. So if I stop this and I look at this from the side, you can see that it's kind of got this interesting big time spread. It kind of creates this thin cone of particles that rain out of the producer. This is another one would be really good for kind of creating some like rocket booster effects, things like that.
Or like if like a meteor is crashing into a planet or something.
Yeah, like you could do some other things like create like shock waves on the front of a jet or something like that. There's all kinds of different ways that you could use this.
Could this be used for like rain bouncing off an umbrella?
Sure. Fractal Omni. So Fractal Omni is kind of a weird one. It sprays particles off in kind of weird, random, fractally direction. This also, you can kind of control extra angle and things like that. And you can see it does some kind of funky stuff when you control the extra angle in the physics a little bit further down the row there. And then we got Fractal Uni, which is kind of another like jet blast spray type of look. It does have a directional gizmo on it again, so you can spray this in certain directions. If you reset and we look at this from the stock standard formation, you can see it's kind of got a random look to it. Could be good for fountains or other looks like that. Fire, pretty much whatever you can think of. All right, so there's the basic types. I'm going to go back to explosive. As we move through here, we're going to kind of create a little bit of animation. We're going to start working with some of the different effects that you can do with the physics. So let's do a couple things here straight away. Just because we're going to need some motion, we're going to have this particle system animate from left to right so that when we get into these different effects down the way, you can see how some of these things interact with motion. So let's go into the producer and set a keyframe at 0 seconds on the x-axis. So I'm clicking the keyframe for position X, and I'm going to go ahead and have it start at the right-hand side of the screen. And then I'm going to have it animate across the screen over the course of 3 seconds so that we can see how motion affects the particles. And I'm just going to have this loop. So I'm pushing N for end for my work area so that it just renders the work area that I want to see, which is about 3.5 seconds. So if I render this out, you can see the explosive stock particle type moving across the screen. Everybody with me? Cool. All right. So velocity. Velocity is how fast the particles are emitted from the producer. So if you crank that velocity up, let's say take it from 1 to 5, you can see that it dramatically changes the look of our particles. This would be kind of interesting for, say, creating like a welding look or something like that. Maybe you have a welder that's on the screen and you want to make it look like sparks are flying off. Well, maybe increasing that velocity can help you change that look. Again, if we slow the velocity way down, say set it to 0.25, you can see that it very drastically changes the effects that we get on our original particle system. All right, the next one, which is actually pretty fun, I'm going to set my velocity back to 1. Inherent velocity. Inherent velocity is a great one, especially if you have something that's got motion with it, right? So like, let's say you're creating a particle effect for a sparkler. Everybody's played with a sparkler before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? And what happens when you wave the sparkler around? It makes a trail, right? But what specifically happens to the little sparkles that come off of the sparkler? What do? They go in the direction that you're moving, right? Yeah, they shoot off of it, but they also inherit the velocity of the sparkler and move in that direction, right? So if we say set inherent velocity to 100%, look what happens to our particles. They take on the motion of the producer. So let's actually animate this a little bit more and give this a little bit more interesting movement, and you can see what happens when inherent velocity is set up on your particle system. So I'm going to go in on the Y axis of my position parameters. I'm going to animate that, and I'm going to have my producer just kind of move up and down in jaggies across the screen. So I'm going to set a keyframe at 0 frames, and then I'm going to move forward 12 frames, and I'm going to have my my producer move up. And then I'm going to move forward another 12 frames and have my producer move down. And then I'm going to move forward another 12 frames and have it move up. And I'm just going to kind of rinse and repeat that until I've got this particle system moving in a crazy, jaggy fashion on screen, so that we can better demonstrate what happens when you use inherent velocity. All right, so I'm going to play this back, and you can kind of see what happens. So it's a pretty interesting look, right? You can see that the particles are taking on the velocity of the producer, right? When it moves up, the particles move up. When it moves down, the particles move down. And you can set that to varying percentages, right? So let's cut that in half. If we cut it in half, it drastically changes the way that the particles move. So I'm going to leave my inherent velocity at 50%, and I'm going to move on to gravity. So gravity is pretty self-explanatory. Gravity is the force that pulls on the particles. And in this particular instance, you can have positive and negative gravity. So you can have gravity that pulls down or gravity that pulls up. If you want your particles to rise rather than fall, say like smoke particles, you'd want your gravity to be negative gravity. So basically going up in the air rather than pulling down to the ground. So if I say take that gravity of 0.5 and reverse it, minus 0.5, you can see that now my particles all fall up instead of down. And you can greatly increase the gravity. So if we say come in here and greatly increase the gravity, it has some interesting effects on our particles. Too much gravity might not be a good thing. I'm going to set that just back to 1. We've just got our standard gravity. Resistance. Resistance is really interesting. So resistance is basically like an external force pushing in on the particles, keeping them contained, right? So if we give this some resistance, watch what happens to our particle systems. The distance in which the particles travel is greatly restrained. The particles slow down. You can tell they're slower because all of the particle hashes are much shorter, right? So when I play this back, we get a drastically different look when we increase the resistance. Extra and extra angle you saw a little bit when I was playing around with particle types that use direction axis. So if I say set this to a directional axis and we turn this on, it almost looks like a spray can spraying paint. So you can come in here, and I'm just gonna give this an arbitrary some arbitrary animation. I'm set up a couple different animators here. I'm pushing U to pull up just the parameters that I've animated, and I'm just going to go ahead and have these kind of change direction over time so that you can kind of see what happens when you play with these direction axes. You can see it kind of starts on spraying on the right and then rotates and sprays to the left. All right, moving right along. So let's play with the floor. The floor can be used in really interesting ways. You can control the position of the floor by using the floor position, and this basically just takes the floor and moves it either closer or farther away from your particle system, depending on where it's set up. Let's see, particle visibility. You can also do some things like control visibility. Like, let's say you want particles to stop at a certain place. Well, you can use the floor so that it will only render particles that are above the floor or below the floor, which is kind of cool. You can see in this instance that my particle system moves below where my floor is set up, and those particles cut off when they hit the floor. So you can use above, below, and none. In this particular setup, it's set up so that you're only seeing the particles that are below the floor.
You can't use both?
You could if you duplicated the system and then set one to above and one to below. And that is actually a great question, Ian, because it brings me to one of my next points about how to use particles. So generally when you guys are going to be creating images or shots that use particles, you're going to want to use more than one system. You're going to want to use 5, 10, 15 different systems, and that's why this can become incredibly rendering intensive very, very quickly. Like, let's say you're creating a campfire, right? Well, you want to create particles that look like fire, so then you have the challenge of creating particles that look like fire, and you're going to use things like blurring and blending modes, overlaying, layering up to create specific looks, right? So, all right, you've got the fire all taken care of. Let's say that's 10 layers. Well, then you need smoke and you need embers, right? So you're going to use a lot of particle systems to create a particle effect that looks realistic. And that's pretty standard. Like even in Trapcode Particular and stuff like that, you saw in their little demo that they were giving that you could layer up multiple effects onto one thing so that you could see what they were going to look like when you're using multiple systems together. So we'll talk about how to kind of layer up a little bit to achieve specific effects as we get further into this. So I'm going to set my particle visibility to above floor. And then we're going to talk about render animation. So if you click on render animation, this is kind of neat. You can say reflected on floor, which is kind of interesting. It almost gives you that below floor look. So even though I have this set to above floor, if I say reflected on floor, it almost reverses what we're seeing and can offer up a reflected image. And this is really handy. Like, let's say you're creating a shower of sparks over a wet, shiny street. Right? You may want the particle system to develop a reflection for you so that you can have it reflect off of the floor onto the surface of that wet, shiny street. So that's what that's handy for. Projected on floor is an interesting one. So this one basically takes your particle system and flattens it so that it's only being seen on the floor itself. Kind of weird, but can be useful. The next one is my favorite. So I'm going to set render animation back to normal. Floor action. This one is really cool. So if you click on floor action, you can see you've got 3 options. You've got ice, which basically makes the floor like ice. The particles will hit it and slide. We're not really seeing them slide right now because these particles have a lot of resistance. And it's also set that the particle visibility is only above the floor. So if we click all, I think we're going to see a little bit more interesting look here. So now you can see that the particles actually hit the floor and stay. What do you guys think that might be useful for? Water, lava. Like, let's say you want lava to hit something and stick to it. You could set that floor up so that the particles pour off of something and then hit a surface and kind of spread across it.
Skittering rocks.
Skittering rocks. Okay, cool. Let's step through the other floor actions. Let's go to glue. So if you set it to glue, the particles stick to the floor where they hit, which is kind of an interesting look. And then let's go to bounce. Bounce is really cool. So again, using the floor to create specific effects is really, really cool in Particle World. So like, let's say you have a dragon shooting fire at a knight, right? And he lifts his shield up to block the fire. You could set the floor where his shield is, and now the fire particles will come down, hit that shield, and bounce off or stick or do whatever you want it to do to give that a realistic look, to have your particles actually interacting with things on your screen. You can see that when you set that to bounce, you get some options for animation. You get bounciness, random bounciness, and bounce spread. So if you play around with some of those options, you can see that you get other interesting looks. Okay, moving right along. I'm going to leave this kind of set up the way I've got it. Actually, I'm going to reset. Reset, back to 1. So I reset everything now. When you do click the reset button, it resets some things and not others. So I click the reset button. I don't believe it resets your anything that you've had animated. So if you animate something and you click the reset button, it's just going to reset the parameters of the particle system itself that you haven't animated. Yeah, go ahead, David.
So for some reason, when I just changed the floor type from like ice to glue, it changes the velocity of my particles.
Yeah, I noticed that too, and I'm not really sure why that happens. Just one of those things, like you just go in and you'd have to adjust the velocity. Okay, so moving right along. So floor we played with, which is really cool. You can see that there's a bunch of interesting ways to use the floor. Direction axis. This basically, if you click on any particle with a direction axis gizmo, you will have these options to specifically control the axis in which it spins or shoots, right? So this is just a more precise way than using the gizmo to control how your particles are being shot out in a specific direction axis. Extra and extra angle can also be used to amp up different directional effects with your particles. So you can see you got X, Y, and Z, and when you rotate them, you get different effects. Cool, cool, cool. Everybody with me? You getting a little bit excited? Seeing some possibilities here with what you can do with particles? I hope so. It's a pretty cool thing. All right, gravity vector. So gravity vector basically controls the direction in which the gravity pulls, right? So like, let's say you want your gravity not to pull up or down with plus or minus gravity, but you want it to say pull to the upper right-hand corner. Well, you can use gravity vector to control the way in which gravity works. So I'm just gonna reset fully Particle World so that I just got the stock effect. And I'm going to go into physics and gravity vectors so that you can see what happens when you change the gravity vector. So I changed the gravity to act on the x-axis rather than the y-axis, and now my gravity is pulling to the right. So like, let's say I wanted to create a rocket booster or something like that of the rocket firing, it's moving from right to left. You might want to change the gravity vector so that the particles shoot out in the proper direction. You can also use that on the z-axis if you want to, which does funny stuff, I'm sure. So now the gravity is pulling towards the z-axis, so it's actually firing away from camera. If I set that to -1, it'll fire at the camera. Now we have like your Star Wars warp effect thing going on. All right, so I'm going to reset my gravity back to 1. So we're through grid, birth rate, longevity, producer, physics, all those things. Does anybody have any questions on any of these specific things? We good? You have questions, Perry? Or are you just saying a lot for fun?
How do I reset the whole thing?
How do you reset the whole thing? The best way to do it, if you really want to get back to 0 if you've animated stuff, is just to delete it and put a new one on. Reset won't reset things that you've animated, per se.
So technically you have to start all over.
If you want to. You don't have to. I'll just say this straight away. Like, this thing is complex enough where I'm betting that some of you are just going to have to start from scratch to get what you want. Sometimes you get into it and you get in over your head, or you tweak some setting and you can't figure out what happened, and you just need to kind of start fresh. So don't be afraid to take a couple stabs at getting what you want to have happen with your particles to happen, because this is a deep effect. So play with it for sure. All right, moving on. All right, so let's get into the particle. Now this one has a bunch of stuff, so it's going to take a little while for us to get through this. We're going to go for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and keep on crushing. All right, so here we go. So particle type. There are several different types of particles that you can use to create different effects inside of Particle World. Right now we're just seeing the line. Let's just step through these. Some of them are really stupid. Star is stupid. Don't use it. It looks like crap. It looks like something that you'd see on cable access. So stay away from it. That's just my personal opinion.
Some children's cartoons.
Children's cartoons. But I mean, if you're working on children's cartoons and that's your look, well then fine. That's fine. So there's Star. And you can make Star look better. Like if you use it really small, it helps it look less stupid. If you use it really huge, it just, I'm sorry, it just kind of looks lame. So obviously birth and death size down there control the size at which the particles are when they are born and the size at which they die. So if you say flip this around and have your birth size be 1 and your death size be 0, and you play back your animation, and we'll decrease the birth rate a little bit here and the longevity so you can actually see these things die on screen.
Fire.
What?
I just made fire.
Good. Stay with me, Perry. Stay with me. All right, so you can see here that the particle, the stupid star, starts off really big and then shrinks down really small when it dies. Let's step through the other particle types. Shaded sphere. So shaded sphere is actually very, very useful. It doesn't look like much right now, but this is really good for creating things like clouds or smoke or different effects where you need something that's got kind of a shaded edge that has a nice breakup to it. And blending modes are also going to come in really handy when you start using different particle types. So you'll see down way at the bottom where it says transfer mode. Right now it's set to composite. If we set it to screen, it completely changes the look of our shaded sphere. Now we have this kind of bubbly, interesting look to our particle system. If you increase the birth rate here and maybe change the colors, you start playing around with a lot of different and more interesting looks. So like if I say start with this a gray and then have this change to more of a dark color, you can see we've got kind of like something that maybe we could make into a smoke effect. Let's keep on cruising here. Faded sphere. I'm going to set this back to composite just so you can see how these rendered. So faded sphere basically creates a bunch of little spheres with a nice faded edge on it. And all these types in this, like you can see, they're kind of they're like basically put into different quadrants, I guess is what you could call these, or different sections. All of these ones, shaded sphere, faded sphere, darkened and faded sphere, and bubble, all use the color map to control their colors. Again, if you use bubble, you can create some interesting effects by using the blending modes when you play back. Bubble is another one that I really tend to stay away from unless I'm trying for a specific effect. It doesn't even really work that well for creating bubbles. So just be critical of what your particles look like. Use them wisely.
Well, we can use bubbles. So, like, say I have a fish that's in a fish tank and I want it to shoot bubbles off. Would that be something I'd want to use, or is there something better?
I would use a custom bubble image to make it look more like bubbles. If I really wanted to create bubbles, I would actually use an image to produce them rather than the stock bubble setting. Because I mean, the stock bubble, like if we put this on a background, the stock bubble setting is kind of lame.
Okay.
So like if I throw like a an aqua colored background back there and we wanted this to look like water or whatever, you can see that the bubbles are kind of weak sauce. Like if I play around with blending modes a little bit, I mean, even so, if you were still trying to like make it look like fish bubbles, they look really cartoony. They're not something that you would want to use for a realistic shot if that's what you were going to go for. And we'll get into how to use custom particle effects a little bit later. All right. I'm going to get rid of that aqua background just to save people's eyes. All right, so there we've got shaded sphere, faded sphere, darken and faded sphere, and bubble. Let's go into motion polygon. So motion polygon is kind of interesting. Now we've got a particle system emitting triangles. And you might think, well, what the hell are triangles going to be useful for? I don't want like my particles to look like something out of Tron or whatever. These can actually be used in very interesting ways. Because of different blending modes and whatnot, you can start throwing things like fades on, and you can get some really interesting looks and effects with the different motion polygon types. I believe they also point in the direction that they are flying. So like if you use a particle type, or if you use a physics type that has like a directional axis on it, you can see that those particles shoot or point in the direction of motion, which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to set that back to explosive. We'll play this back so you can kind of see what they look like. So we've got motion polygon, motion square, which is similar to what we saw, except it's squares instead of triangles. And again, you can create some really interesting effects with these different motion types. If you do things like add motion blur to your particle systems, this can create some... Oh, that's right. You got to force motion blur for these things. I totally forgot. Yeah, that's fun. I'll show you how to do that later. All right, so there's motion square. Can kind of do some interest. Like motion square would be really good for creating like flying paper. Like if you increase the size of your particles a little bit and make them like 8.5 by 11 looking. And then say have it like twirling, like if you wanted to say make papers flying around on a set or something like that, you could use motion square to help that effect out. So you'd obviously want to layer that effect up with some actual pieces of paper flying around if you could, or animating different things in there to help the effect out, but this is a cool way to use it. Tri-poly. So tri-polys are similar to what you saw with the motion poly, but they don't actually point in the direction of motion. They kind of point in random variations or random directions. Quad poly is also similar to what we just saw with the tri-poly. Again, this is a square polygon instead of a round one, but you can see you can create some interesting effects with that as well. We'll keep on going here. Textured tri-poly. All right, so you can't see anything when you turn on textured tri-poly. Any guesses as to why?
There's no texture.
Because we have no texture. Exactly. Nice. So we're going to get to the textured versions later. but just know that they are in there. You got textured tri-poly, you got textured quad poly, tetrahedron, which makes actually little 3D particles. You can see that these things actually have three-dimensional sides to them when you spin around the little axis thing on top. And if you set that to cube, you'll see that it creates a bunch of little cubes. Like, let's say you wanted to create a shot that had like falling salt grains or something like that. This could be a really interesting way to help do something like that. I mean, just for fun, I'm gonna go ahead and throw some bounciness on these particles, and you can see that it does some kind of cool stuff. So like if you did want to create a shot that had, you know, falling salt grains or something like that, this might be a way to do that. Let's see, what else do we have? Lens convex. So lens convex is a 2D image. It's basically like a 2D circle, and it just sprays a bunch of little circles out. And again, lens convex works off the birth to death math color that you have set up. So if you want this to, say, take on different colors, oh yeah, so you can you use custom color maps? Okay, no, you can't. So lens convex actually works off the color of your layer solid. I thought it worked off birth to death, but all that's grayed out down there. So that's why I had us create a gray solid, is because a lot of these different particle types work off of the color that you create your solid with. So like if I come up here and I change the color of my solid, I'm going into solid settings and I say change this to bright red, all of my lens convex particles now are going to take on that bright red color directly from my layer solid. That also is the same. I think that's the same for all of these in this kind of like in this quadrant, or in this section of particle types. Lens concave also works off of the color of the layer solid. And I believe these ones have like a little bit of gradation to them. Fade is basically just a faded circle. Lens darken fade is just tightened up a little bit. The fade's a little darker.
Did you use that for blood splatter?
You could. It'd be tricky.
Okay.
Blood splatter's tough, man. Things like if I was gonna, I'd say like if you were gonna do blood splatter, your best bet would be actually shoot either paint or something like that and try to get real practical effects from it, rather than like toiling over for hours like a cheap particle generator like this one. And then obviously a lot of time and thought went into making this, and you can do some cool stuff with it, but recreating a blood splatter would be really difficult with this one. Trap code would probably be better for something like that, but like fluid dynamic stuff is really, really tricky to get to look correct. I mean, even like you could spend hours with Particle World trying to just create fire that looks realistic. So it's like this generator can be used in really effective ways, but you just kind of got to be smart about how you approach it. Like honestly, the best way to utilize fire is to go shoot real fire and use real fire. It's just so much easier to create it or shoot it and then use it than it is to try to make a particle system make fire look perfect.
There is full stock packs that you can buy where it's fire assets, blood splatter assets designed for this application.
Yep, exactly.
Did you use Particle World in the Defenders thing you did?
No, not really.
Not really?
Nope.
Do that.
What was that, Perry?
Let's totally do that. Like this time, let's not some other people eat like coffee.
Okay. Let's step through a few more of these. Lens bubble, and then we'll go on break. Lens bubble is basically derivative of the other bubble setting, but it utilizes the layer solids color. Let's step through the last ones. All these ones are textured, so they actually need a texture to work. So if you click on textured square, you're not actually going to see anything on your screen because we don't have a texture set up for it. All right, take 15 minutes. Let's get back at like 7:20. Please be back on time. If you're playing hacky sack, get back in here at 7:20, please.
All right.
Can you hit the lights for me, please?
You can play with that.
Nah, I'm going to eat my dinner, guys.
Make sure those knees are working well, right?
I'm working on it. Trying to break me so I can't teach. What now?
So you can't go on vacation.
For real.
Abandoned ship.
You know the mountain scene, all the airplanes and everything. I think you can do something like this.
Abandoned
It
ship.
froze. It's full, but it's all ice, and it's gonna be like that for days.
Yeah, that happened to me. It was, solid.
Yeah, it's pretty much
I wonder whose fault that
brick
is.
of ice. I left it in the car. It's mine.
Yeah. Oh, no coffee for Todd.
It's not coffee, it's water.
Oh.
Oh. My H6 or H264, whenever I try to do anything with it, it always corrupts. I don't know what.
Always crashes.
Yeah.
Well, didn't you run into that problem last time?
Yeah, but it changed. I went to a quad core, and they said there was issues in the old software, but I'm like
You're on the new stuff.
I'm like brand new.
Weird. You can just do it through QuickTime.
Okay.
Just export it as animation and then compress it with QuickTime. I showed you how to do
Okay.
that. You
Because
know how to
I
do that,
did
right?
send you my second one, but it's still 59.
Meg.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do this.
You pull. Oh,
Just run it through QuickTime conversion. So you go in here and you type in QuickTime. Oops, shit. Erase on the keyboard.
you see when it's still fucking hot.
Yeah, so you come into QuickTime and just open up.
Yeah, you just open it up
Yeah,
and it
then you
automatically
go
converts.
export iPad, iPhone, iPod Touch, and then just do the 1080p one.
I'm so sorry.
It's all good, dude. No
I
worries.
could have done that.
Well, I would
you-
say you should do that and just turn in another version that's compressed, so that it's just for download purposes, so that it's faster to download.
Yeah, I was having so much trouble, and then I got here and I decided, well, why don't I just animate it and then open it up in QuickTime and convert it?
No, that works. That's fine.
I did it, but it's still huge.
Even after you ran it to QuickTime,
Yeah, it's like 57
how long is it?
seconds.
It shouldn't be that big.
Oh, can you open it up for me?
I would make sure you use this one though. iPod, iPhone, iPod Touch, Apple TV. If you use this one, that one's a pretty uncompressed H.264. I would use that one. That one works much better. And it still looks halfway decent, which is nice.
Because I added a huge move file behind it.
Oh, okay.
That's 100 and compressed. It's 180.
Oh, it doesn't really matter.
I could be late once in a while because I'm coming from St. Paul.
I get it. I know that's a bitch, especially at 5 o'clock.
Oh yeah, you have no clue.
Oh, I do actually. I drove from St. Paul for years coming here. Right in between Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yeah, I'm coming from Fort Snelling.
Oh yeah, you're in the shitty part.
62.
Yep. I feel your pain. I live in Farmington, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
lived in Eagan, and I lived in St. Paul, and I lived in Minneapolis. I mean, shit. I worked 7 miles south of Care, and it took me 30 minutes to get up here during rush hour.
It's horrible.
So I get it.
I'll just let you know if I walk in, I'm not.
Yeah, if you're running late or whatever, if you can just shoot me a text and say, hey, I'm running late,
Okay.
just to let me know. And then at least I'm in the know.
Okay. Gotcha. Thanks.
No problem. I could probably pause it. Pick it back up where we left off. All right. So we're looking at the particle types and controls. We've kind of gone over the different types. Burst size, death size. So let's play around with some of these other things. I'm just going to pick a... I'm going to use motion square. So obviously we talked birth size, death size. Birth size increases the size at birth. Death size increases the size at death. There's some cool randomizing options that you have, like size variation. You can increase the size variation, and it'll create particles that are varied in size up to 100% of their original scale. So if you set that to 100%, they could come out being size 0 or up to size 1.34. Max opacity controls the maximum opacity of your particles. I was set at like, what, 75? Something like that. Opacity map. Opacity map controls the opacity of the particle over time, right? And this can be really handy, especially for stuff like smoke and fire, stuff where you need it to become more translucent as it either ages or is born or whatever. So right now you can see the opacity map is just a curve, right? It comes on and drops off. You could set this to be, say, like a linear drop, and you can see that that just creates a nice, even-looking birth to death opacity map. You can also do interesting things like create peaks and valleys, which will give you some kind of weird effects with your particles. So now you get these kind of random, chaotic birth to death opacities. So that's the opacity map. Color map. So fortunately, there's a lot of... I'm going to reset this real quick. Fortunately, there's a lot of interesting ways to control color with your particles. You can use the birth to death particle system or particle color system on several of the different types. You can also set this to some options, right? Origin means the color of the layer solid that you're using. So if your layer solid is, say, red, and you change this to like a bright yellow, it will start out with the layer solid color, but then change to the death color over time. Birth to death is what they are from what you have them set originally. So birth being this color, death being that color, pretty straightforward. Birth to origin is the opposite of birth to death. So now they're starting yellow and becoming the bright red that is my layer solid over time. Origin constant basically means that they take on the layer solid color no matter what. I'm going to leave that set to custom. You also have the ability to do a custom color map. So this is kind of neat for creating weird and wild color variations. Like I'll just set this up in extreme variation so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So I'm just setting up different colors for each of these sections, and we'll play this back, and you can see that now the colors are born magenta, become orange at 25% of life, they become green at 50% of life, they become blue at 75%, and then they die yellow. So you can create some interesting looks there. That's really handy for creating stuff like smoke and fire and whatnot. You can like start the particles out like a bright, yellow or white, have them turn to orange, then to red, and then for like a smoky death, they could become black or gray or white, depending on how you set that up. So there's some interesting options there when you play with the custom color map. Okay. I'm going to just set that back to birth to death, and I'm going to reset just to get everything back to its original look. Okay, so volume shade. That one's actually kind of interesting. So volume shade, I think, only works on particles that have a 3D element to them. So like if you, say, set it to cube, I believe then that allows you to play with the volume shading. And you can see when I slide that slider around, it changes the way the cubes are shaded. This is really kind of an arbitrary thing. There's not really a rhyme or reason to it. It kind of looks like, is it lit from the left or lit from the right? I don't really know exactly what that means, but you can create some interesting shading with volume shade. Transfer mode. So transfer mode is an internal blending mode on Particle World. So it basically allows you to create some different color mode effects. Works really well for some of the types like where is it? Tri-poly or quad poly. If you have a bunch of particles and they overlap each other, you can see you start getting some interesting lighting effects when you use the different blending modes. So whether it be screen or add. If you use black matte, I believe what it does is it creates an alpha matte of your particles. So if you needed to use this to create a matting effect on a certain shot, or you wanted to separate your particles from something else somehow, you can use black matte to help you create some matting effects. I just set mine back to composite. The other thing that you can do is you can use blending modes and multiple layers of particles. So like, let's say I wanted to layer this up a little bit, and if I set these blending modes to different things like add, color dodge, etc., you can see we start getting some interesting looking effects that way as well. Okay, moving right along. All right, transfer mode. And let's just look at extras real quick. So extras gives you control over the effect camera, which is basically like when you click on your particle system and you control the camera. I don't know why I can't see it right now. So that is the extra effect camera. So you can see that when I rotate this little gizmo around, it changes all of the parameters inside of the extra camera, the effect camera. So you can kind of use this to fine-tune the way that your particle system is viewed in 3D space. So if you're trying to set your particle system up so that it matches perspective on a shot, you can come in there and you can actually control the parameters individually so that you can manipulate it and make the particles look the way that you want them to look. You can also use an After Effects camera. So if you have a camera in your composition, and you can put one in by saying Layer, New, Camera. It gives you a little camera pop-up. You click OK, and now by default, the extra effect camera is overridden by the camera that is in the particle system. We aren't really playing with cameras much right now. If you really want to play with cameras in your assignment, you're absolutely welcome to. But for this one, we're going to just stay away from the camera until a later date. Depth Q. This one is kind of interesting. You can basically use depth Q to fade your particles out over time, or sorry, over distance. So I believe the way this works is that you can set different distances, and the particles will become more or less distant or more or less visible depending on what you set this distance slider to. That's kind of interesting. Like if you create a big Z-space particle systems and you have particles, you know, in the foreground and way off in the distance, you can kind of cut the particle system off a little bit with that depth Q setting. And I believe if you say fog, if you say fog, it will actually colorize the particles at a different distance. So let's see if we can't maybe visualize this a little bit better. So I'm going to go into my producer, and then I'm going to increase the Z distance, the Y I'm just going to leave alone, and the X distance. So I'm creating a big giant circular particle producer, and then I'm just going to move it up in the air to make this kind of look like rain almost. I'm also going to increase the longevity a little bit so that my particles are falling down through my system. So let's see if we can't make this visualize a little bit better. So if I rein this in a little bit, pun intended, I guess. So I think the further away this is set, the more... So you can see that we've got gray particles, the ones that are way off in the distance, and the ones that are in the foreground or closer to the camera are full color. So this is just kind of an interesting way to help give your particle system a fog or a depth cue, if that is pertinent to the shot that you're working on. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and reset one more time just to get things kind of back to normal. We'll go over the last few extras, and then we'll start playing with the different textured particle types that you can use. So there you got depth Q, light direction. So light direction works on particles like the cube that I pulled up from before. So if you change the particle type to cube, and we look at this again, you can see that the light, you can actually control where the light hits these from. So you can kind of fine tune how your particles are lit by using the light X, Y, and Z sliders to control that. It's not the best thing ever, but it'll do a decent job for effects like that. Hold particle release. Okay, this one's kind of interesting. So hold particle release basically makes it so the producer will only start producing particles at a certain percentage away from the birth area, right? So if I move this forward on the slider, oh, okay, no, I'm incorrect. I apologize. I haven't used this one in a long time. So this is kind of cool. So what happens is the particles are born, but they don't actually start flying away from the producer until 50% of the life cycle has happened, right? So if you set the longevity to say like, let's just call it 2 seconds, right? So what's going to happen is if this is set to 50%, it will let particles be born and die, but they won't be released until after half of that longevity cycle has happened. So you'll see particles be born, but they won't be released from the producer, and then after 1 second, in this instance, then they will start being released from the producer. I haven't really run into an instance where I need that, but it's kind of it could be used in an interesting way if you're creative with it. And composite with original. So composite with original basically means it will composite your particles over the top of your original layer. So if you wanted to say stick particles on a layer of video and you wanted to see the video, well, you'd click composite with original. I don't recommend doing it that way. I recommend creating a separate layer solid and using the layer solid to work with the particles and leaving your video layer alone. Random seed. Random seed is really, really useful. So let's say you're working on creating a fire effect or something like that. I'll just set something up here real quick. I'll reset this and set this to fire. And then you can see that we've got fire particles being born. All right, let's set the particle type to, say, motion square. You can see we've got a bunch of different squares there. Now, if I set this on, say, 2 seconds, and then I duplicate this particle system, they're exactly the same, right? There's no randomness to these at all. But the way that you can change that is by using the random seed, right? So if you type in a random number in there and hit return, it will create a new particle system basically. So same settings, everything else is set exactly the same, but now we have a new seed number and it gives us particles in different orientations. So this can be really helpful for layering up certain effects inside of particle world and just creating a different looking particle system that doesn't exactly match the one that you originally created. So like you could come in here and change the particle type on this one to say motion poly, and now you can see I've got squares and polygons set up, but they are in different orientations. So that seed is a good way to create some randomness within your different particle systems if that's something that you require. Okay, so the next part, this part's pretty cool. Textured particle systems. So let's say you wanted to create, say, like, I don't know, a shower of skulls. How about that? A shower of skulls. You want to create a shower of little skull particles flying at the screen.
Lord of the Rings.
Sure. Or snowflakes or bubbles or whatever. Something that's got an image that you can use to actually create your particles. Let's go ahead and open up a browser. And let's go find an image that we can use for this. So a couple of the things that you want to keep in mind. I'm sorry for the brightness, by the way. You don't want these textured images to be too huge. The bigger they are, the longer they take for the particle system to process. So ideally, unless they're really close to camera, you want to keep the like pixel by pixel width of these down as much as possible. Like I would say 100 by 100 is a good starting spot. unless those particles are passing really close to camera. And if they are passing close to camera, what you can do is create several different systems of varying intensities, right? So like the ones that are far away from the camera, you could use like a 50 by 50 texture, right? The ones that are really close to camera, you could use a 500 by 500 texture, and you're going to see the detail better in the particles that are close to camera. So it's kind of, you can kind of set this up to not overtax the system and make the render times go way up, because when you start adding textures to particles, it's going to increase your render times, because it basically takes that texture and creates an iteration of it for every single particle on the screen. So if you have a huge birth rate and tons of these things coming onto the screen at the same time, it has to reproduce that texture image hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands of times, and it just makes the render time go way up. So let's type in a skull icon, and we'll find something neato, like this little guy right here, or this little guy right here. I like the one with the horns on it. That's cool. Ooh, and it's even a PNG. That's great. Ooh, even better. Look at that, Punisher skull. Nice. I'm gonna go with the Punisher skull. So this Punisher skull is 310 by 355. That's a good starting spot. So let's go ahead and view that image, and I'm gonna right click and say save image as. And then I'm gonna, you know, save my files and all that good stuff. And I'm gonna say Punisher skull and save it. So I now have my Punisher skull JPEG image, which is handy. I'm gonna go back into After Effects, and I'm gonna import that file. Punisher skull, boom. I'm also going to save this. Sorry for those of you who might be watching on YouTube for taking up your valuable time. All right, so I have my Punisher skull. I've brought it in, and now what I need to do if I want to use this as a texture is a couple things. So it's 310 by 355 right now. That's fine. I'm gonna go ahead and throw that onto my comp down in the layer stack, and I'm gonna shut off its visibility so that I don't see it. And now we're gonna go into our particle system and set it up so that it can reference that image in the comp to create hundreds of little Punisher skulls flying all over the screen. All right, here we go. So I'm gonna go ahead and just reset this, so we're starting kind of from scratch, and we're gonna go through how to get Punisher skulls flying all over our screen. All right, so we've got our particles. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select a textured version of our particle. So I'm gonna go into particle type, and I'm going to choose textured square. The reason I'm choosing textured square is because we're working with almost a square image. Now, ideally what you'd wanna do is you'd wanna take this particle Punisher little guy and put it on a perfect square composition. Something like, you know, whatever this number is, let me see. I would make it 355 by 355. So let's just actually do that. So I'm gonna take my Punisher skull, throw it on its own composition, and I'm gonna go to composition settings and just make this a nice even number on both sides. So it's 355 by 355, I click OK. You can see we got a little black bar on the side. So I'm gonna add a second layer solid in, just white, and dump it behind my Punisher image. And now I've got a perfect square image. And this is just gonna make it so that the particle system renders the skull with proper proportions. If it's a funny number, it's gonna stretch it or squash it to fit in a perfect square. So you generally, if you're gonna do this with a square, you wanna set it up so that it's a perfect square. So I'm gonna go back into the main comp, I'm gonna ditch the Punisher skull that I have, and I'm gonna put that composition down there and shut it off, and that's what we're gonna use for our particle texture. All right, so I have textured square turned on, and you'll see that underneath that now we have this texture dialog, and it's asking us for a texture layer. And I can say texture layer, I want Punisher skull. And now you can see we've got a whole bunch of little Punisher skulls on the screen. If we did, say, if we go in here and we use an invert, I think this will work. Nope. So I'd need to do that here. So I'm just going to invert this so that I get white skulls on black instead of the other way around. Oh, let's see. What is it? Why? I'm going to change my solid to a black solid so that I have a white skull on black, and that's just going to help this look better.
How do you change your solid color like that?
Just changing the solid color. So it's Command-Shift-Y, I believe.
Do you know where you go to it, like in menus?
Yep, it's in Layer, Solid Settings.
Okay.
So Layer, Solid Settings, and that'll pull it up and you can change it. All right, so I'm going to go back over to my main comp, and you can see that's done the trick. Now I've got white little Punisher skulls flying out of my producer in all kinds of funny directions.
If you're on the background, if the background wasn't black, would it still have a black square then?
Yes.
Okay.
Ways to get rid of that are by using your blending modes, right? That's going to kind of come in handy, and that's just the way that one works. Is it works off of black and white. If I wanted that to be white skulls, what do you guys think I would need to do?
Well, I guess,
Oh, sorry, Cameron, you had a question?
yeah, could you possibly just bring that and then illustrate it in Adobe Illustrator and then just export it as AI and then import it as After Effects?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, that'll work. Vector images, I think vector images will work. Not 100% sure. I don't know if I've done that one before. And now I'm wondering if I used a PNG, if it would actually carry transparency and I wouldn't have to worry about the little black board. It does carry transparency? Awesome. So if you use a PNG or something that's got an alpha channel on it, it's going to carry the alpha channel, which is really nice, and that will make your particles nice and clean. So that would be the ideal way to do this. So what kind of ideas come to mind? Like, how could you use the textured particles to create certain effects? Okay, I'm more specific. Like snowflakes. Perfect. Snowflakes, rain droplets, bubbles. Like if you wanted to find a good bubble image on alpha.
Bullet rain.
Bullet rain.
Yes, bullet rain.
Bubble icon PNG. Those are terrible. Don't use those.
Broken glass.
Yeah, I would use something like this right here. This is really nice. That's way better than the standard bubble could ever wish to be, right? So that's the kind of stuff you'd be looking for if you were going to create a textured particle system. Go ahead, David.
When you're making stuff, do you look to see if that's like copyright free or anything, or do you just generally, when it's no one can tell what it is at the end, do you just use it?
Okay, so right now it's set up on birth and death color. If I wanted it to be white, I could do that a number of ways. I could just say custom, and I could change the color. Oh, sorry, that's custom color map, my bad. Birth to death. I could just set these both to white just to make it easy. And then the skulls will be white. If you change the layer solid to a white color, mine's red right now, and you just set this to origin constant, it's going to take on whatever your layer solid color is. So, I mean, that could work. That's kind of cool.
What if it wasn't like it was like a complicated thing with like a rainbow color or whatever, like the object is just black?
Then you're gonna want it to have it pull. Oh, that's a good question. If it was a rainbow color, I've never dealt with that one before, David. I'm not really sure, to be honest. That's a good question.
So if I have if I had clouds or whatever of an image I got online and it has like its own colors, how
you might be able to that's a really freaking good question. I don't know if I'm wondering if like let's say we had the Punisher skull and it was rainbow colored, right? Like if we use that as the layer origin, like if it would use that. I'm not really sure. That's a really good question. we can figure that out at a different date. Okay, so you guys, now we've gone through the whole particle system, right? You guys are probably coming up with some interesting ideas for your homework. Now we're going to put this to use to actually create something that is specific and it makes something that has a function, right? So, ideas. What should we do? What should we make? Okay, awesome. I'll show you some stuff that other people had made. 1 second here. We're going to do a jet thruster. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of reset my particle. I'm just going to start from dead scratch. And we need to find something to make into a jet thruster. Now, if you're doing a jet thruster, what did I say in the assignment? You can't use copyrighted material, so you got to find something that's non-copyright. Or you need to make it yourself. I would love it if you guys made these things yourself. I'm trying to think if there's footage that I have that we can use to create something cool. Okay, so we are creating a rocket taking off with particles. So I'm going to import my little rocket image that I created. Well, I didn't create it, but I borrowed it from creativecommons.org. Alright, so I've got my rocket image, and the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of doctor this up so that we can get rid of the flame that comes out of the back of the rocket. So I'm going to put my rocket on its own composition, and I'm just going to use a mask to mask off the bottom of this rocket so that it's just clean, kind of at the base right there, and we can create all the fire ourselves. Maybe I come back and use the fire later to add some pizzazz to it, I don't know. Alright, so I'm just going to use the pen tool. And I'm going to punch in here a little bit, and I'm just going to cut this off like so. Whole lot of booping going on over there. And in order to get it to show correctly, I need to change the mask type. So I've created my little mask. And I've opened up the mask parameters, and I'm going to change where it says add, or the mode of the mask. I'm going to change it from add to subtract. And then that just gives me my little rocket with no fire on it. So I can add the fire in myself. Okay, so we have the rocket. Now we need to set up our shot, right? So let's set our shot up. I'm going to go back to my main composition, and I'm going to drop my rocket composition in there so that I can see my rocket. And obviously it's way too big right now, so I'm going to scale it down a little bit and move it down kind of to the bottom of the screen. I'm going to scoot it to the left. Alright, we'll pretend it has a background and the whole thing like that. So when you create your shot, please do try to create a fully realized shot, not just an object with particles on it on a black background. If it were me, I'd go in and like find a little scaffolding for it to take out of, maybe put the NASA logo on there somewhere, give it a nice background, etc., so that it looks legit. Okay, so now we need to add our particles. So let's go ahead and make a new layer solid. So layer, make sure you have your composition layer stack selected too down there. So composition, layer new solid. And I'm going to use a black solid, and I'm going to call it particles 01. Actually, let's call this fire particles 01 because we're going to have fire and smoke in here. So fire particles 01, I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to put that particle layer behind my rocket. I kind of want the edge of the fire to come right out of there, so we're going to make this fire out the particles behind the rocket. All right. So then we need to add particle world. So I'm going to go to effects and presets and type in particle. And there's particle world right there. Let's go ahead and throw that on our layer solid. And we can start working our fire. Okay, so any guesses as to maybe what particle types we want to use, or what producer types we want to use, or what physics types we want to use? Any ideas? No? Well, we could try cone axis, jet sideways. That's actually a good one. Let's see if we can get that direction axis. It's a little too wide for what I want. Could resist it, but that's going to look a little weird. Let's go, can try fire. Fire's kind of cool.
We do fire and then invert the gravity.
I'm just kind of trying to get a good one. Yeah. I'm going to go with direction axis. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically make this directional vector point straight towards the ground. If I can. Let me see. Floor direction axis. Okay. That's fun. That's better. This one might not be the best for this particular usage. It really wants to go horizontal. It doesn't want to go straight down. Okay, skip that one. I'm going to go with Vortex just to make this easy. Okay, so I've got Vortex. And Joe, what you said earlier about inverting the gravity was right on. So I'm going to go ahead and flip my gravity the opposite direction. I'm going to say gravity minus 0.25. I want to get my gravity to point in the right direction. And I'm going to reset my camera so that it kind of looks correct.
It's not inverting the gravity.
Yeah, that one might not actually use gravity.
I know fire uses gravity.
Wow, okay, yeah, fun. It doesn't use gravity. It uses the direction axis again. Can we get it to point at the ground? Yes, we can. There we go. Alright, so it looks like if you want this to point to the ground, you need to set it so that the direction axis is pointing on the Y.
Is that vortex?
Sorry, yes, that is Vortex.
So yeah, I have to manually change it so that it actually...
Yep, you have to manually change the direction axis to Y, and then it will spray the particles out on the ground. So what are some of the first issues that we're running into with this?
It's not actually coming out of the rocket.
It's not coming out of the rocket, so we need to position it correctly. What else? It's a little big, isn't it? So we needed to start out small and grow over time, right? Cameron, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was gonna say an easy fix that I got. I just made a camera and a null object, and I just paired the camera to the null object. Made the null a 3D, and then I can actually move the, I guess the particles without.
Oh yeah, so you can just use the camera, kind of manipulate the particle system. Yeah, that will work. The only issue that you could run into is if you start playing around with some of the other parameters, they might invert or flip or do weird things just because you're using the camera to control it. Okay. But it's not a huge deal as long as you can wrap your brain around it. Okay, so obviously it's a little bit on the big side, right? We can't see any of the particles. I think we should have the particles bounce off the floor. So let's set up our floor here too. So I'm going to go into physics, vortex, particle, where is it? Right here. There it is. Floor, and then particle visibility, all render animation. I want these to bounce off of the floor. And like I said, I think that the floor needs to be a little bit lower. So we need to kind of change the floor position a little bit. I gotta actually see if this is working.
Oh.
Not for me.
Makes me wonder if Vortex doesn't work with the floor. Where is it? Okay, so if I set this back to Vortex, and it doesn't, that's weird. Okay, that's kind of sucky.
Could it possibly only do it once you do a RAM preview or a render?
It should, you are seeing the rendered particles when you look at it like this. So there's no like high quality setting or anything like that. You're actually seeing what you're gonna see. And some of these animation types just don't work with certain things. Like it looks like Vortex doesn't work with the floor. I'm gonna test it out a little bit here to see if we can see what's happening. I'm just gonna change positions around here a little bit and the floor position a little bit. Yeah, and Vortex does not work with the floor. Bummer.
Fire doesn't seem to either.
Fire doesn't either.
I'm just using cone axis and it works.
Cone axis works? Cool. All right.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we got to work a little bit on our gravity. So cone axis will work. Good call. Let's set the gravity to 0 because it looks for me what's happening is, did you see what happened right there? With the gravity on and the vector set the way that we have it, it's pulling our fire off its trajectory, which is what we don't want. So I'm just going to shut the gravity off, which will then give us this very nice looking cone axis. Good call on that. Thank you very much.
Got the team on the bench.
Word. All right. Okay, so I want to reset my camera a little bit. I wish this had a reset button for the camera, but it doesn't. There we go. All right. Good call. Cone axis will work wonderfully. I'm wondering if we can get this to get it to spread out just. Oh yeah, look at that. Spread it out a little bit so that it doesn't all go in place, and that might be something you want to play with over time too. All right. So that was extra that did that. That spread the cone out a little bit. Okay, so position it. We want to position it correctly. And our floor is going to have to be a little bit lower in order for this to work right. I'm basically going to bring it up right next to the rocket so that it looks like it's sitting right on the ground right there. Okay, cool. So, all right, we got our kind of producer in position. I'm going to set this so that it bounces a little wider. Maybe we set our floor just a little lower. That's kind of cool. Okay, so what are some challenges you guys are seeing right away with this? What are we going to need to do to make this look more realistic? We need to have it move. What else? What's staring us right in the face right now? Okay, good. So what happens when smoke goes all around things, right? Fire goes all around things. So we've got the particles behind our rocket. So we're going to need particles in front and behind, right? To make this look a little more realistic. So I'm just thinking down the line, right? Thinking about how we need to execute this. So once we get this particle system set up, we're going to want to create another iteration of it, but in front this time rather than behind, so that we can have particles coming in and out on both sides of the rocket, so it looks a little bit more 3D, right?
Make the rocket layer in 3D space and put it like in the middle.
Nope. Unfortunately, it does not work that way. So here's the tricky thing about Particle World. Particle World is a 3D effect, but it doesn't actually look at any of the other 3D layers in the composition. It's its own thing, right? So it will work if you use like a camera effect or something like that will work in 3D space. But unfortunately, like if I make the rocket layer a 3D layer, it doesn't care. It doesn't see it as in front or behind the particles. It's just a layer on top of that particle system.
Those other particle effects do that?
Nope, none of them. That's just one of the crappy things about Particle World. I think Trapcode actually does interact properly with 3D layers, so you can actually put 3D layers in the midst of particles, and they'll go in front and behind, but we need to fudge it in this instance. Okay, so motion, obviously we need to animate this to make it do stuff over time, and we need to be a little bit picky as to how we go about making that happen. So first thing I'm going to do is animate the rocket. So I'm going to start with my rocket in the position that it's in right now. So I have my rocket selected. I push P for position, and I'm going to set a keyframe at 0, but I'm going to move it out a little ways. I'm going to give this a couple seconds before the fire turns on and the rocket starts moving. What happens when a rocket takes off? Tell me about the motion. What does a rocket look like when it takes off? Excellent. It starts slow and builds speed over time, right? So we want this to kind of take off slow and build speed up as it's leaving the frame. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to start at 0, or start with our rocket in the position that we have it right now. And then we're going to set another keyframe further along. I don't think this shot needs to be 10 seconds long, per se. If you guys want to, you can break it up into multiple shots. If you want to take on more than one shot in 10 seconds, that's totally cool. I'm going to just run this out to 5 seconds and call it good. So in 5 seconds, my rocket is going to move up off of the screen, like so. Okay, and then what can we do to give our rocket that starting off slow and speeding up over time look? Keyframe interpolation in the graph editor. Excellent. So let's go ahead and do that. So we've got our position. I'm going to go into my graph editor. I'm going to set up my first keyframe so that it's an ease out. And I really only need to do that, because my first keyframe is really the only one that matters in this instance. I don't need to do anything to the second keyframe. All I need to do is do stuff to the first keyframe. Go ahead, David.
So if it's ease out, why does it go like above on that following one? It also affects the velocity of that the endpoint too, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just the first.
So this one changed the interpolation of that keyframe, right? It went from a linear interpolation to an auto Bezier interpolation, and we're looking at the speed graph, not the value graph. So the value hasn't changed, but the speed has changed, right? But this is still a non-interpolated keyframe. So I guess the question I'm saying is, like, no matter what, it needs to take a certain amount of time to get from point A to point B, right? And depending on where we set these handles, that speed is going to change depending on how these handles are set, right? What we saw before was just a straight line that went from point A to point B. When you change the interpolation of the front, it's going to change the speed over time to get it to that position on the back end.
I had expected it to look like when you just did it, where you just grabbed it and made it so that it's like straight. It goes up there. That's what I thought it was going to look like.
Right, and it doesn't, and that's honestly what we want. So that's fine. So we can do that, and then what we'll do is we'll take this other handle, and we'll just stretch this out so that we get kind of a parabolic looking liftoff pattern. Like, that's pretty much what we want. So if I preview this animation, this is what we're going to get. Right? Pretty spot on. Now, obviously, we need to match our motion with the producer, right? On the the effect itself. So this is, and I was talking to Cameron about this earlier, this is unfortunately one of the crappy things about Particle World, is that it doesn't use a coordinate system that matches the coordinate system of the composition, right? So like when we set the position of this rocket, so I'm going to get out of the graph editor here real quick. So the position of this rocket is 673 by 890, right? Well, okay, that means that the position of our particle system should be close, but it's not. It's this arbitrary coordinate system. The position of our particle system is minus 0.15 x and 0.24 y, right? So animating the motion of these particle systems can be a little bit tricky. If you guys want to get into doing things like motion tracking particles to an object, there is a crazy tutorial on Video Copilot on how to do that, and you'll also notice that in the homework write-up, if I can get that up on the screen here real quick, you'll notice that I posted this in on the bottom. So it says Video Copilot has some great tutorials on particles that will stimulate your mind and give you ideas. Do not turn in a copy of tutorial, blah, 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 blah. There is a Video Copilot tutorial called 3D Stroke Effect. And in that tutorial, they basically use this expression that's typed in on the X, Y, and Z parameters inside of Particle World to make those particles stick to a light that's moving around in 3D space, right? So if that's something you guys are interested in, go ahead and check out that tutorial in Video Copilot, the 3D Stroke Effect tutorial, and it'll show you how to use this expression to make your particles go where you want them to go on the screen. That basically this expression makes After Effects override the arbitrary coordinate system that Particle World uses and makes it use the coordinate system of the composition rather than its own arbitrary deal. And I told Cameron this too. Particular is great because it actually uses the coordinate system of the composition rather than its own garbage, so that you'd never have to do any weird expressions like this to make it do what you want it to do. But if you do want it to do certain things like move around and match something that you have moving in your composition, this is what you guys need to tackle. I'm going to let you handle that on your own time. Those of you that are more savvy, go for it. If not, you can just hand animate, and that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to go into our particle system, and on our Y coordinate, we're going to go ahead and set a keyframe at the same point. So what we basically want to do is we want to get this particle producer to match the motion that we have for our rocket as close as we can, right? So we kind of want to create that same parabolic effect, and we can go in and we should hopefully with the speed options be able to see and get real close to matching it. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and set that keyframe, which we already did. If you click on your particles and you push U, it will pull up that coordinate with the keyframe on it. So we have that for position Y, and then for position Z, or position B, A, Y, B, whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about. For position A, we have the first keyframe. For position B, we want to just get as close as we can so that the particle system kind of matches the motion of our rocket. So I'm going to go ahead and have my producer lift up into the air and get as close as I can to where the rocket would be. So obviously it does not work without the proper keyframe interpolation, so let's go in there and give that a shot. So I've got my Y position selected. And you can, I believe, select both positions, Y and the position of the other parameter, and you can see them overlaid. See, the pink is the position of the rocket moving, and the green is the position of the particle moving. And I don't know how well this is going to work. I'm totally kind of eyeballing this right now. Sorry?
What did you click to see both of them?
So you can click multiple parameters, right? If you just click one parameter, it displays in gray, but if you hold command and click on another parameter, it will pull up both so that you can see both. Now again, this is one of the problems with an arbitrary coordinate system. the numbers are so tiny on the particle world system that we probably aren't going to be able to match this by looking at both of them. We're just going to kind of have to look at the parabola that we have set up there and get it as close as we can so that it looks right. So I'm just going to click on position Y. I'm going to set my first keyframe to ease out again. And then I'm just going to use the handles to kind of create as close as I can the motion. And you can also see it's upside down, right? So and I'm sorry that particle world is this way. I don't know what the guys that made this were thinking when they created it, thinking, oh, let's just create our own arbitrary coordinate system. It'll be great. Yeah, no, it's terrible. Change it. If you ever watch my tutorial, change it. Change it. Okay, so let's give it a shot and just see what it looks like. We should be pretty close. All right, so you can see it's kind of lagging behind a little bit. And if we come in here and we just kind of like manipulate these handles a little bit, we can kind of get it to match up. And we should be able to get it really, really close. Okay, I'm just going to manipulate it a little bit more, and I'm kind of clicking and holding shift so that it sticks to the values that I've set. This is pretty close. Gets off there a little bit in the middle. Not terrible. All right, so what I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to go to my position keyframes, and I'm just going to check the influences that I have set, right? So this might be the way that we match it. So the way that I did that is I just clicked on the position parameter of my rocket, and then I double-click the keyframe, and that pulls up my keyframe velocities, right? And it tells me the pixels per second speed and the influence of that specific keyframe, right? And you can see that the influence is set to 81.61373. If I click on... if I click on that value and I copy it and click OK, and then maybe go back over to position Y and double click that first keyframe and paste it, I can probably get a lot closer to matching the positions or the values of those two keyframes. So I'm going to do the same thing for the last keyframe too. I'm going to double click that position, and it says my speed is very high, 367.43 pixels per second, but I don't have any influences on either end. I'm going to go back to particle world and see what that looks like over here. Yeah, and you can see this one has an influence on it, but the incoming velocity is like negative 0.20. Stupid arbitrary systems. Anyway, do the best you can. That's pretty much where we're at. And this looks passable. Like, this isn't terrible. So let's give it a look-see, and then we'll start working the actual looks of the particles. So it's kind of nice. The particles bounce real nice into the air. And then as they take off, the cones out nicely, and you got kind of a cool looking effect. So I think the life is a little bit too long, and our bounces are probably way too bouncy. So I'm going to play around with things like the bounciness. I'm going to pull the bounciness in a little bit. And I'm going to turn the bounce spread up a little bit, and this is what we're getting now, which is a little bit better. Cool. Okay, not terrible. And you can animate these things over time too. Like, you could go into the bounciness and give it more or less bounciness over time depending on what effect you guys are going for. Alright, this is looking okay. So it doesn't look like fire. That's the big problem we have right now, right? Looks pretty craptacular. It looks like a bunch of little lines, and we need it to not look like a bunch of little lines. We need it to look more interesting. So let's go ahead and play around with layering this up a little bit and playing with some different particle types and things like that to give us a look that is a little bit better than what we have right now. So the first thing that I try to do is I try to work with what I already have, right? So I think one of the ways that I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my fire particles, I'm going to duplicate the system that I already have. Then I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the random seed. I'm just going to set the random seed to 1, and that's going to give me different particles. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to half the birth rate and increase the longevity just a little bit. And then I'm going to come over here and start using some effects. So I'm going to use fast blur, and I'm going to blur this one out a little bit. So I added fast blur, and I'm just going to add a little bit of blurriness to this so that I've got some blurry particles mixed in there with my sharp little particles. And then I'm going to change the blending mode. And I'm going to set the blending mode to screen. And this is going to brighten it up and make it start to look a little bit more glowy and interesting. All right. Doing okay so far. Okay, and now let's take that a little further and make yet again another duplicate, and then let's go in, change the random seed again. So I'm down there in the extras area, and where it says random seed, I'm just going to set this to 2. It's going to give me a new version of the particle system, and now I'm going to change the particle type from line to, let's try motion polygon. And if I solo that layer, you can see now we just got a bunch of little triangles firing out of where our rocket would be. And so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually blur the crap out of these, and I'm going to change the birth and death size a little bit. So I'm going to set the birth size way down, but I'm going to set the death size up a little bit. So this is going to kind of give us some bigger chunks of particle that are going to spray out of our whole system. And then the other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of change the coloration a little bit too. So right now it's going yellow to orange. I'm going to set this to like a whiter color to almost make this like a more of a smoky looking thing. You can see it starts to give us a little more randomness. Starts to look a little more interesting. And honestly, I would do this even for like all the different line types, because the line is just weak. Let's see, so particle, I'm gonna come in here and start playing around with some different types. Solo that one so I can see what it looks like. All right, so that one is just a bunch of little spheres, right? But I'm going to increase the birth rate way up, and I'm going to change the composite type to add so that they create more of a fiery look.
Increase the bounciness of the gray ones and the spread when they look like clouds.
Yeah, you're probably right. So let's try that out. Let's increase the birth rate so we get more of them. And then, yeah, I think increasing the bounciness is a good call. So let's go in there and do that too.
The spread of it.
Where the fuck is it? Physics, that's where it is. Floor. Physics, floor, bounciness. We'll increase the bounciness and the spread a little bit. And yeah, I believe we're going to start getting a little bit better smoky looking.
Didn't you say you wanted to put the smoke in front of the rocket?
I'm just working on trying to get something that looks decent right now. But yes, at a certain point, I'm going to take layers and start putting them in front of the rocket so that it looks like the fire isn't just behind it. All right, so the line one isn't super strong. That's the first one, I believe. So it might be a good idea to start coming in here and naming your particles so that you know what's what. Like this one should be called smoke particles 1. This one should probably be called like fire sphere, and this one should be called fire line, so that we kind of can differentiate what these look like. The lines aren't bad. I just feel like there's too many of them. If we knock the birth rate way down, they'll just kind of help it out. They'll help it look a little bit more legit. You get that kind of ember, sparky look from those. Yeah, and that might be one of those things where you know, change the bounciness or the velocity. Like what I'm seeing right here is like, I feel like we need that classic rocket shape to it, right? Like where it cones in a little bit underneath the rocket rather than just spraying down. Of course, we could go and we could look at our references to see what we've got there. I mean, most of these references, the fire goes just like super far behind the rocket, like this one. See, it goes pretty far. Same with all of these, the puffy, billowy clouds too. All right, so let's go and keep playing with some of these different particle types. So I'm gonna go with what Damien suggested. I'm gonna duplicate my smoke particles. I'm gonna put it in front of the rocket this time. And then I'm gonna do some other things. I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna change the particle type to cube. It's gonna give me these giant, kind of puffy looking smoky particles. Actually looks pretty damn good. Okay, so now I kind of want to work, and you can taper these off too. So like, okay, we got this smoke particles in front. It gets really big and crazy, and then once this thing starts leaving, I'm gonna taper the birth rate way off. So I created a keyframe there on the birth rate, and I'm just gonna have the birth rate go from where it's at like 5 down to 0. And so those cloud particles will stop being born, and we won't see them anymore. Right, that helps. And then I want to do some more work on kind of getting the fire coming out of there to be a little bit more dense, right? So this is another place where we can kind of go in on, say, like our fire sphere and maybe increase the birth rate as it starts to take off and get a little higher up. We'll increase the birth rate. So I've got my fire sphere 1. I'm setting a keyframe on the birth rate and pushing U so I can see where the keyframe is. And I'm just going to start increasing that birth rate so that the fire becomes more dense. You could also do stuff like maybe increase the scale of the spheres at the front so that it's a little larger. Right now it's set to 0.13. I'm going to increase that scale a little bit, have these die down a little bit more. Going to scrub through and just look where it's at. Oh yeah, now we're getting somewhere. You can also change the birth and death colors over time too. That's kind of cool. So like, I like that yellow at the beginning. You could even change it to maybe like a orange whitish color. And then the death color is still that bright, that dark red. I'm gonna change that to like a dark orange color. And then I can have those change over time too. So I'm gonna click keyframes on both birth color and death color. And as this is lifting off, I'm gonna have this color become more of like a nice bright orange color. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, go ahead, David.
So can you have any other surface, just either like modify the floors to make it bumpy or like have like there's a building next to it? Like is there any way to add additional surface whatsoever?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
Nope. Yeah, that's one of the limitations for sure. You can't really make it 3D geometry. Although, I mean, you can create some pretty realistic looking effects with it just using it the way it is. But yeah, there's no way to make like a rounded surface or a bumpy surface or anything like that with it. All right, cool. So this is looking pretty decent. I'm gonna change the longevity over time here too. So, oh, I can't change the longevity over time. That's right. Boo. How about resistance? Can I turn up the resistance over time? Not on cone axis. Oh, so many limitations. Okay, so this is starting to look decent. I'm going to take my fire sphere and duplicate it and throw one on top of the rocket so that I've got one above and one below. That's going to help out with my blending modes a little bit. I also changed the mode from screen to add, which is going to give me a little bit more hard, fiery color in there. Let me see, what else can I do to this thing? I'm going to give it a new random seed so that it's not exactly the same as my other one. Oop, that was on the smoke effects. I meant to do that here. Random seed, we'll set that to 3 so it will vary things up a little bit. I'm going to come into the colors and give this a little lighter orange color, which gives me that nice white hot rocket look right there. Another thing that I might do here is pump the blurriness up a little bit so it looks a little more interesting. Ooh, yeah, it's nice and white hot down there when it takes off. Creates a pretty good looking effect over time. Yeah, you can come in here and start playing with velocities and shading and all kinds of stuff to really kind of help this look good. If you wanted to, you could get really creative and then throw over throw a lens flare over the top of this thing. Lens flares, people. New solid. We'll call this lens flare. I'm gonna put it on black because it shows up better on black. And then we'll go over here and type in lens flare. Throw that over the top. Fortunately, the lens flare does actually work off the coordinate system that is used here, so we can go in on our rocket and kind of find the position keyframes there and duplicate those position keyframes and paste them on our lens flare's flare center. So you can see now that nicely moves. We might need to alter it just ever so slightly. So when you put a lens flare on, you need to set the mode to screen. You can see that it's taking the original position of the anchor point of my rocket. So I want to kind of change that a little bit. I want that to be down lower, like right here. Another kind of neato trick. See, that should pretty much stay right where it's at. We don't want it to be 100% there, so we're going to want to animate our flare brightness over time. So I'm going to set this up so that once it's about a second in, it's going to come up to full strength. Looking pretty good. And then the other thing that I'm going to do here on the brightness is I'm going to give it a wiggle modifier so that it looks like it's flickering a little bit. So the way that you do that is you hold Alt and click on the parameter that you want to add an effect to or an expression to. And then I'm going to type in wiggle, and then you have to do parentheses, and then basically I think the way this works is it's how much you want it to wiggle by how many times per second. So if I type in like 10, 10, it will wiggle up to 10 of the parameters, so 10 brightness units, 10 times a second, I believe. So you can see it flickering on the upper right-hand corner. And then it just stops, which is perfect. So I probably want to have that kind of fade off there at the end. So I can come back in there and set a keyframe and then have it fade off as it reaches the top of the thing. That's kind of the cheap way to do it, but whatevs. And then we can play with that wiggle parameter a little bit. Maybe we'll set this to 20, 20, so it'll wiggle a little faster. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Sorry?
So that shit almost looks right.
We're doing all right. It would pass for a cartoon for sure. But you guys are getting the gist, right? Like using multiple copies of the particles, different particle types, playing with things like blurring and blending. We can also do some stuff like add distortions to them. So like I'm just gonna take one of my layers of fire, quote unquote, and I'm gonna throw some distortion stuff on there. Let's try ripple. So if I throw a ripple on there and I kind of make the ripple center where the rocket would be, and then we increase the wave speed and the length and its radius, you can see that we can create some kind of interesting looking effects by utilizing different distortion fields and things like that. You can change, you could make the ripples really big or really small. You can increase the wave settings. There's all kinds of neat ways that you can kind of help make your particles look a little bit more interesting and realistic. Again, if we're going to use the ripple, I would probably want it to ripple from the center of where the position is for my rocket. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that position. Again, the way I'm doing this is I'm actually clicking on the parameter itself and hitting Command C, and what that does is it copies both the keyframes, and then you can go up to say like a ripple, center of ripple, and put a keyframe down and paste the ripple center in there, and if you need to adjust it a little bit, you can. And now you can see that ripple effect kind of travels along with where the rocket would be, and if we throw the rest of our layers on there, it just helps it out a little, which is good. You could do the same thing. Let's just see what happens if we copy that ripple and maybe paste it on the fire sphere in the background to help it out a little bit more. Not even seeing if that's actually doing what it's supposed to do. And it's not. Yeah, it is. All right, cool. So it's definitely rippling a little bit, but I'm going to push it a little further, increase the wave speed. You can do things like change the phase too. You can animate the phase over time, which does cool stuff. Maybe have the radius be animated too, so that it looks a little bit more interesting when it's starting up. So I'm going to have the radius kind of start at 0. Oops, that was blurriness, not radius. Okay, radius at 0-ish. And then as it takes off, I'm going to have it increase its radius so that it takes up more of the rocket. And I'm going to just change the amount of these waves a little bit so they're a little bit on the smaller side. Here we go. And then I'll turn everything back on and kind of see how it looks. Not too shabby. Cool. Any questions? You guys good?
So good. More or less.
Go ahead, Damien.
I kind of missed some parts of how did you get the smoke effect?
Okay, so smoke, what I did is I just took one of the original particle systems that I was using, duplicated it. So here, we'll just go over it. Like, let's say we just have the one particle system, right? We just have the lines. All right, so what I did is I duplicated the lines, and I'm going to unsolo the original. And then what I did is I changed the particle type from line to cube. And the reason I use cube is because it's shaded, right? It has different looking sides on it, which is going to give it some interesting kind of like cloudiness, basically, when you blur it out. And then what I did is I changed the colors. So instead of orange to red, I went like light gray to a dark gray. I increased the birth rate quite a bit. You can also use screen and stuff like that to give it a little bit more density around certain areas. You might want to play with the dark and lights just a little bit to make sure that they're not too intense. And then I threw a blur over it. And I really like fast blur. It says it's obsolete and legacy, but it works really, really well, and it's really quick. Like, it renders really fast. So I still use it all the time. So I threw a fast blur over it, and then once you blur that out, it kind of gives you that cloudy look, and it works really well.
Okay.
So it's basically just like, it's getting in there, it's playing with the different effects, kind of getting one set up so that it works well for you, and then taking that one and changing it, layering up, using blending modes, changing some colors, adding some distortion, some blur, and a bunch of stuff to kind of just give you the look that you're working towards, right? I mean, you could even make this better by going in and adding real fire to it. Stuff like that, like add some actual video fire into it so that it looks really legit. So let's take a look at this one more time just to see what happened when we added that second plume of smoke. Yeah, not bad. Voila. So other fun things to do here would be things like actually color correcting the rocket so that it looks like light is hitting it, like the light of the orange fire around it has some effect on it, right? So you might do something like go to the rocket itself, add, say, like I like hue saturation. I use hue and saturation a lot. So I throw hue and saturation in there. And then what you can do, you could do this with a secondary layer too. That's actually probably a better idea. So if I duplicate my rocket layer and set it to, say, let's just set it to screen to start. So this isn't going to be on the whole time, but we can kind of set it up so that it has kind of an orangey look to it. So I'm just going to increase the saturation so I can see what color it is. So there I got a nice orange look to it. And then I could go in, and once we've got some good fire going on, I could kind of use the opacity to make it look like that light is actually hitting the rocket a little bit. I'm going to back this off, set this to 0. Go like that, and you can kind of see that color is hitting the rocket a little bit. You might increase it a little bit over time. You might even do something like grab a mask and like cut part of this off so that it doesn't go all the way up the rocket. So I'm going to feather this out a little bit so that it's nice and soft, and then I'm going to subtract it instead of add it, and now you can see we've kind of got that lighting working on the bottom half of the rocket instead of the top half of the rocket. So there's like 8 billion things you can do to make things look cool, right? You can really push it, and you've got 2 weeks to work on this. So please take some time. Make this look cool. What I would suggest you guys do if you're video people is, grab one of the 4K cameras and shoot something for this. Like, look at some cool movie stuff, like things you've seen in movies, whether it's like The Matrix, the hand going through, rain droplets or whatever. Like, find something cool. Some other cool ones that people have done in the past, like I had one student who just shot himself walking down the hall with headphones on, and then he motion tracked the headphones and used like little note textured particles and had note particles flying off of his head, and he was kind of moving his head around, so the particles were moving around. He used inherent velocity and things like that to make them look really cool. It might be kind of a cheap, cruddy plugin, but you can do a lot of neat things with it. Like you might take your camera outside, set it up on like a slider or something like that, and just do a shot of like a dude, walking out into frame and turning around, and you put the snow in as particle effects in front of him, behind him, some close to the camera, some far away from the camera. There's lots and lots and lots of different ways that you can utilize particles in interesting ways. And for you folks that are in motion graphics, or not motion graphics, if you're in video and you're interested in like visual effects stuff, like use this as a visual effects project. You got 2 weeks to work on it. You have time to like set up and plan and light and shoot a shot that's 7 seconds long. Just be very focused, right? Like write down what you want to do. Make a stupid little storyboard, like a 3-pane storyboard that says what's going to happen over your 7 or 10 second shot, how the particles are going to be used, what you want them to look like, where they're going to be. Are you going to use fog? Are you not going to use fog? Are you going to use fire, flames, whatever it happens to be? Just really spend a little bit of time and plan it and do some cool stuff over the next 2 weeks. I mean, ideally, what would be great is for you guys to walk away with something that you can go, I can throw that on my reel. It's not just some shitty cartoony thing that you would never want anybody to see outside of class, but you can actually use to get yourself work when it comes down the line. Any other questions, you guys, before we call lecture good? You guys in good shape? All right, cool. I'm sticking around. If anybody wants help with ideas, I'm here to help out. If you guys need help with anything, let me know.